There is something that happens in the first few years of parenthood that almost nobody names directly. Not the exhaustion, not the overwhelm, the mental load. The way your to-do list never actually ends. Something quieter than that. And, in some ways, harder to carry. The sense that you have looked up one day and cannot find yourself in the room anymore. Not dramatically. Not in a way that announces itself. Just a kind of absence where your interior life used to be. A reaching for the person you were and finding the role instead. That experience has a name. And the fact that it has never been given to you is not an accident. It is a gap in almost everything written about what parenthood actually does to a person. That is what this video is about. When people talk about losing themselves in parenthood, they usually mean the surface things, the hobbies they no longer have time for, the social life that contracted, the spontaneous Saturday that became a logistical operation. And those losses are real. But they are not what this video is about. What this video is about is something underneath those. The loss of the felt sense of self, the version of you that had an interior life that was yours, preferences that were not about someone else's well-being, opinions that were not about nap schedules or school decisions, a way of being alone with yourself that was just yours. The version of you that knew, when the day was over and the house was quiet, what you actually thought about things, what you found interesting, what made you feel alive. That version did not disappear because you failed at something. It disappeared because the role you took on, the full weight of it, the constancy of it, the way it occupies every available surface of your attention, left no room for it to exist. And somewhere in the second or third year, when the emergency phase settled into the permanent phase, you looked up and realized you could not locate that person anymore. That is not a small thing. Research on the psychological experience of becoming a parent, work that clinicians have been doing under names like matrescence and parenthood. The documented identity disruption of the transition to parenthood consistently shows that this is not about individual adjustment or attitude. It is a genuine reorganization of the self. One that happens fast, without warning, and in most cases without anyone handing you a name for what is occurring. There is a reason this has felt like grief. We are going to get to that reason. But first, the thing that almost nobody says out loud. Here is the paradox at the center of this experience. You love your children with everything you have. And you also grieve the person who existed before they arrived. Both of those things are completely, simultaneously true. And the reason this has been so hard to carry is that the culture around parenthood does not have good language for the second part. Parenthood is framed in almost every conversation, every piece of content, every well-meaning thing people say to new parents as an arrival. You become a parent, you gain a child, you join something. What is almost never named is what the transition costs at the level of identity. Not in a complaint, not as a warning, just as a true thing that is part of the full picture. And so when the grief shows up, and it shows up in almost everyone, even the people who would never use the word grief, it arrives without a container. It arrives as a vague wrongness, as a kind of flatness in moments that should feel meaningful, as the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who need you and still feeling entirely alone. And then the internal voice comes. You probably know this voice. I should be grateful. Other people would give anything to have this. This is what I chose. I don't have the right to feel this. That voice is not wisdom. That voice is the absence of language. Because here is what is actually true. The grief is not ingratitude. It is not evidence that you love your children less than you should. It is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that you had a self-worth grieving. The grief exists because something real was lost. Not because you are weak or ungrateful or failing to appreciate your life, but because the identity reorganization of parenthood is a genuine loss, embedded inside a genuine gain, and you were never given permission to hold both at the same time. The problem is not that you feel this. The problem is that you have been feeling it without a name, without a container, and with an internal voice telling you that you shouldn't. That ends here. Here is what I want to say as carefully and directly as possible. You did not lose yourself. You lost the version of yourself that existed in a particular context, a context that is genuinely, irreversibly gone. That is why it feels like grief. Because it is grief, real grief, for a real loss. Not metaphorical loss, not I have less free time loss. The loss of a self that was built over years, that had its own shape and texture and interior life, that you knew how to be. That self lived in conditions that no longer exist. And the reason this particular loss lands differently from other identity changes, differently from a job change or a move, or even a significant relationship ending, is that it happened without your consent, at a speed that outpaced your ability to integrate it, in a culture that told you the only correct emotional response was joy. You did not get to prepare, you did not get to grieve in real time. You did not get to stand at the edge of who you were and say a conscious goodbye before stepping into who you were becoming. It just happened. And then you were supposed to be fine with it, so here it is. Directly, you are allowed to grieve this, not instead of loving your children. Alongside it, because both things are true and the truth of one does not cancel the truth of the other. The love is real, the loss is real, and carrying both of them, without language, without permission, for however long you have been carrying them, that is one of the most quietly difficult things a person can do. You have been doing it. And here is the other thing that is true. The thing that most content on this topic misses entirely. There is a self being built in this, right now, not the old self that one lived in a context that is gone, and it is not coming back, and pretending otherwise is not hope. It is avoidance. A different self, one that has been shaped by this, by the weight of it, by the love inside it, by the specific kind of strength that only comes from doing something this hard for this long without adequate support. You have not been able to see that self clearly yet, because you have been too close to the building. But it is there. If this opens something you have been carrying for a while, there is a resource in the description called Who Was I Before? A guided workbook built specifically for this, not for recovering who you were, for mapping who you are now, and beginning to build forward with intention. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Building forward does not mean starting over. It does not mean a self-care routine or carving out time for old hobbies, or any of the other things that well-meaning advice typically reaches for when this conversation comes up. Those things can be part of it, but they are not it. Building forward means beginning to pay attention to the self that is already emerging, even inside the role, even in the middle of the exhaustion, and giving it enough recognition that it starts to become visible to you. There is something you still find yourself caring about, even now. Something that makes the quality of your attention shift. A book, a conversation, a problem, a craft, a question. Something where you are suddenly present in a way that is not about anyone else's needs. That thing, however small, however intermittent, is not a leftover from who you were. It is a signal from who you are becoming. The work of this period is not to recover the old self, it is to begin to notice these signals, to name them when they show up, to treat them as data about who you actually are, right now, in this life. That is not dramatic. It will not resolve the grief overnight, but it is the difference between a self that is happening to you and a self that you are, slowly and imperfectly, building on purpose. One thing you can do tonight, not as a practice, not as a system, just as a single act, is to write down one thing that made you feel like yourself this week. Not a good parent, not a productive person, like yourself. It may take a moment to find it. That is fine. The finding is the point, because the self that is worth building forward into is already leaving traces. You just have not had the language to recognize them as yours. If you want to go deeper on this, the resource in the description, Who Was I Before, is built exactly for what this video opened. It is the next step when this conversation is the one that finally landed. Link in the description and the pinned comment. And before you go, what is one thing, even a small thing, that still makes you feel like yourself, separate from your role as a parent? Leave it in the comments. It matters more than you think. What I want to leave you with before you go back to whatever the rest of tonight looks like, the parent you were trying to become, the one you could picture clearly before the full weight of it arrived, is not gone. The self you have been reaching for and not finding is not absent. It is mid-construction. It is in the part of the process that looks, from the inside, like nothing is happening, when actually the most important work is occurring underneath the surface. The version of you that existed before has done its part. It brought you here. It is allowed to be grieved. And the version of you that is being built inside this, the one that knows things about love and endurance, an invisible labor that the old self could never have known, that version is already more present than you realize. You cannot see it clearly yet. That is not evidence that it isn't there. It is evidence that you are still in the middle of becoming it. The person who sat down to watch something this direct at this hour about something this private, that person is not someone who has given up on themselves. That is someone who is still fighting for the version of themselves that they know is possible. Not who you were, who you are becoming. That is not nothing. You stayed. And that, in fact, is the thing.